Welcome to Talking Tuesday. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today we're going to talk about cultural differences. So, just to lay the groundwork here for those of you that are new to the channel, the podcast, YouTube in general, those of you that don't know me, I run these channels and I come from a background in quantitative finance. We typically talk about topics both quantitative and qualitative and career based and all that, but it's always around this technical aspects. And so I think it's important to lay the groundwork here stating that quantitative finance in the United States, so this is where I'm at, where I'm working, is actually predominantly international. So yes, I'm an American, I work in the US, I do quantitative finance, and yet I am probably, I don't know, every colleague you have, you might have 1 in 10, 1 in 20 that are American, and the rest just come from around the world. There are a lot of Chinese and Indians. There are also a handful of South Americans, Africans, and Europeans as well. So we get the good mix of everybody. But in general, most people are not going to be from the US. And so it's a common question I get, which is, Dimitri, what do you notice that is culturally different? Typically, international students that are going to be coming into the industry ask this because they kind of want to fit in, they want to blend. But today we're going to talk about the differences. I'm not going to specifically talk about a culture. So I'm not going to say, this group of people does this for a variety of reasons. One, many cultures have similarities across them. So while in the US it might not be common to do something, that thing might be common in multiple countries, multiple cultures around the world. Also, it can be regional. So somebody might come from a specific region in their country, and it is quite common to do something, and yet the rest of the country doesn't have that. So I'm going to try to avoid stereotyping and labeling here, but we're going to talk about some of the differences. Again, none of these are good, none of these are bad. They're just differences between cultures, and I'll talk about them a little bit from a US perspective. Again, you can pitch in on the international perspective, right? I would love to actually see some of you from the international side talking about the craziness of Americans. I will mention, I think, one or two of my bullet points here, which are going to be American kind of things that make it challenging for others coming from other countries. So let's just dive on in. Okay, so the first point here is going to be making noise while you're talking, which indicates that you are listening. So Americans don't typically do this. So you'll be having a conversation, you'll be talking to me, and the other American will just be like kind of nodding, so like a visual cue, but they don't make noise. And I actually interviewed a buddy of mine on one of these videos, and as I'm like talking to him, he's going, mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. And while he makes these noises, right, someone just put in the comments like, oh, it was super rude that he was doing this, and, it was like he was hurrying you and he wasn't paying attention. And so somebody got really upset, and of course I looked at their name, and I'm guessing they're an American, so they don't quite understand. But yes, some cultures, when they're listening, will actually make a noise, like kind of like a nod, kind of like a hum, right? Indicating that like they are listening, right? They're involved, they understand what you're saying, and it's just like a cue. So in America, we don't typically do that. I actually get used to it because a lot of my colleagues do this, and I've actually picked it up somewhat. So sometimes when some of these colleagues will be talking, I actually will mirror what they do. So I'll end up doing that too, and just be like, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and just kind of going along with the conversation. I think it makes them feel more comfortable. I think it makes the conversations go smoother. I'm not actually against it. I think it's kind of an interesting thing. But again, it's not real common in America, and it does happen quite a bit with different cultures. The second one here is when people say yes to things, even if they don't know how to do it or won't do it. So culturally, there are some cultures where it's better when you're assigned something, you just say yes, and then you go and you figure it out. From an American perspective, and from a lot of other cultures as well, so there's kind of two sides here, it drives us nuts on the American side when you say, yes, I'm going to do something, and then you don't ask questions when you don't know how to do it, and then it ends up taking you longer, and you're trying to ask people and get help. It's definitely a cultural thing, which I have seen. It drives me nuts, though, because I'd rather you just say up front, like, hey, Dimitri, I don't know how to do X, Y, and Z. I'm more than happy to do the assignment, but can you give me more details? And then I can lay it out for you in a more detailed process. And it makes it easier for me because now I know that you're going to have some questions, but also I know that you're going to be able to do the job because I've given you everything you need. it also helps you because now it's not like you take the assignment and then you take longer than expected, and now I'm kind of upset, like, hey, I gave this to you a week ago, why haven't you finished it? Which does occasionally happen. And then you check in with them and find out that, oh, they want to do the assignment, they're trying to get help, but they didn't ask you for the details, and so now they're kind of stuck. So I know this is cultural. It drives Americans nuts, though, because if you don't know something, just say, like, hey, I don't know how to do this, or I know how to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm not quite sure how to do the last piece of it. Just ask the question. Don't be embarrassed. It's completely fine. I'd rather help you up front, and we're all on the same page working together to get a goal done, than you taking something, you feeling terrible, me being upset it's not done on time. But yes, a lot of cultures end up saying yes to things, even if they don't want to do it or they can't do it. Just be honest and upfront with me, and we'll figure it out from there. So that's the second one. The third one here is going to be a annoyance more so, but it's something that Americans also do, and it drives a lot of people nuts, including myself. And that's going to be bringing in fish or seafood for lunch and microwaving it. In general, just foods that stink. Why? So in many cultures, eating seafood is common. In the US, it's not as common as other countries. But when you bring it to lunch for work, it makes the entire room smell. Nobody wants to smell your seafood, dead fish plate, essentially, for like hours after lunch. And yes, when you microwave your fish or your, I don't know, whatever seafood you brought in, it stinks and it makes the office smell for hours. It's not like, oh, it's unpleasant for like the 10 minutes while you eat. It's just not good courtesy. It's not good manners in general in the US. And yes, I go to the office all the time and there's always some American doing the same thing. So this is definitely not something that's only an international thing. This is just something that's, I guess, common courtesy that I would like to mention. But again, most of us are somewhat, I don't know, kind of accepting, and it's like, I understand you either you don't get that, right? It's not rude in your culture or your kind of scenario here, or at the same time, I don't know, it's just common for you. So I'm not going to judge you on it, but it is kind of annoying. The next one is going to be timeliness. So this is something I never realized until graduate school. We would have group assignments and projects, and we would say, hey, we're going to meet, for example, like at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and you would go and you would wait, and it would be like 3:10, 3:20, and then people are showing up, and the rest of us are kind of irritated, like, why aren't you here at 3? That was the set time. So yes, in different cultures, all over the world as well, because I've ran into this with multiple countries from different continents, timeliness is something that is valued in the US. It might not be valued in other places, and it is definitely office cultural as well. So I've had office cultures where they don't value the timeliness, and we expect things to typically start 5 or 10 after. Again, this is probably just because there's a mix of cultures, and so people are trying to be accommodating. But at the end of the day, if I say the meeting starts at 3, I expect you to be there at 3. Yes, in other countries, this is not the same. So something to kind of be aware of here if you're coming from another country. If you have an interview with someone, for example, definitely be there 10 minutes early. If you're going to be starting a new job, I would always be there 5 to 10 minutes early. Try to get to your meetings, try to figure out what is the cultural standard internally, but realize that most Americans expect it to start on time. So another point there. And the next one we're going to talk about here is going to be respect and hierarchy. So these are things that are kind of baked in. It's hard for me to talk about because of my personal ideological beliefs. I am essentially an Austrian economist and a libertarian. So if you don't know what that means, I value the individual more than the group and the whole. I think the individual's rights and freedoms are more important. I think though in the US, we tend to, at least other Americans, for example, and US citizens, tend to gravitate more towards the individual. Definitely not as much as I do, but they're going to be more towards the individual side and less towards kind of the team and hierarchy structure. It's still there somewhat in the US. Definitely an important fact of who's reporting to who, for example. But age is also another key factor in many cultures. So for example, if you are older, you are an elder, you will be respected because of your age. In the US, in a capitalistic market here, and especially in finance, this isn't as common as other areas. And the reason being is because, right, you'll see someone that's worked their way up the system. They might be a director at 35. They're managing people that are, I don't know, in their 50s who are beneath them in different levels. And so you're managing from a young age below you. This isn't as common in other cultures. It's something hard to work with. Um, this kind of ties into another bullet point I had, which was giving credit for work where it's due here. We'll kind of tie all this together. Um, in the US, though, there's not, there's really not a hierarchy based on age. And so it's hard to believe, but yes, there's at least not so much like I mentioned in finance here. And so in other cultures, for example, I'll just give an example here. I have some colleagues that will, look at somebody and say, "Oh, what's their title?" And they get really excited and they go, "Wow, he's a senior director of whatever, a managing director. He must be a really important person." And they treat them very differently because of the title. So from my perspective, I'm off further than the average American here, but I don't really care what your title is. I don't care if you're the CEO, the CFO, managing director, or an analyst on the bottom. For me, you're going to have to learn to earn respect across the board. Again, most Americans aren't quite as off the side as I am. They're more or less like it matters who your boss is, right? You report to your boss, you're on time, you respect them. Again, I still do that. But at the same time, for me, it's like I don't really care what your title is because it shouldn't really matter, right? If you're an analyst, I'm going to treat you the exact same as if you're an executive. I think just being equally fair is, I don't know, kind of my MO. It's what I go with. But in general, you'll see cultures where this doesn't work. I'll give you an example here. I had a manager who, again, she is on the far other side where internally she has a belief system, and I'd figured this out over multiple conversations with her, where I was expected to do work and I was not to take credit for the work because she was going to be the manager. So therefore she took the credit for the work, even though she was not involved in any of the process. And she was like adamantly upset that I told somebody that I did that project, which made complete sense in the setting because they had questions on the project, which she couldn't answer because she didn't do the work. But she was mad because culturally, I'm not to take credit for this. I am a lowly analyst on the bottom of this totem pole, and you are my manager, and you will dictate this. And it sounds a little crazy when I say it, but there are cultures out there that respect people based on the title or based on the age here. I'm not a fan of this. Be aware, though, when you come to the U.S., there will still be a hierarchy of title. So like, oh, you're I don't know, an analyst, an associate, a vice president, I don't know, associate director, director, all that, managing partner, whatever. There is still a hierarchy, and you still have to follow the rules of course, your boss tells you to do something. You need to more or less do how it's being structured or asked of you. But at the same time, be aware that it's not going to be as strict as like your boss told you to do something and it's wrong, and so you just do it. In America, it's more common to kind of challenge and discuss and work as a team. Again, team is somewhat big here in the individual, but the hierarchy is much more fluid in the US than it is in other countries. Okay, and that leads me to no napping at work. I know this sounds kind of funny to some of you, but yes, I have colleagues that take naps at work. It's completely fine on your lunch break. But we had a scenario where we had a colleague that was new. They were fresh from graduate school, from their country to a U.S. grad school to an actual job. But yes, napping is not common in the U.S. You can't just take a nap at work because you're tired. I have colleagues that will do it during lunch, for example. But in general, it's not looked highly upon in the U.S. to take a nap during work. And in many cases, someone actually might reprimand you and say you're being paid to work, not to nap. So again, trying to take a hands off, like we've had to remind people like, hey, we might not be that busy, but we're not really supposed to be napping at work. Culturally, though, in other countries, yes, there are naps. And in other countries, for example, you're actually trained from a child. There's always a nap time all the way through like elementary school and through college, I've heard, in some countries. And so this nap piece, I think, is critical and a key component to many cultures. It is not a thing in the U.S. I don't think anyone would like go crazy and like, I don't know, yell at you. But it's just kind of awkward as an American having to like wake you up from a nap and then explain to you like, it's not really okay. And senior management's not going to be happy that we have colleagues that are napping. So just kind of another interesting fact. Hygiene, again, I've mentioned other ones, is huge. So if you're interviewing or even at the daily job, right, take a shower and wear deodorant daily. This is like an American standard. I know this is not the same in other countries, especially when you interview, though. Like if I interview you and you smell, most Americans are going to be put off by that because for multiple reasons here. If you're interviewing you, I expect that you're trying to put your best foot forward, meaning you should essentially have showered because you're trying to make the best impression, at least for the interview. If you're like that in an interview, it's going to be an issue in the office on a daily basis. Most Americans don't like the smell of body odor. It's a cultural thing, again, in the US. Other countries, it's fine, it's okay. I've had friends, family, and stuff that lived in other countries, and they think it's odd that we shower daily. So, yes, even my American friends who have moved to other countries have lived there, and then are like, what's the big deal? Like, right, you can take a few days off. In America, shower, deodorant, brush your teeth every single day. It'll make you more likely to get a job from an interview, for example, and it'll also make it more likely that you'll work well with your colleagues, especially those that are American colleagues. And then the next one I'm going to talk about here is going to be talking in your native tongue. So speaking your native language, I have no issue with this, but there's a huge caveat here. When you're in a meeting, if you start going into your native language with somebody next to you and you have other people sitting in the room, it is extremely rude. So yes, this is very rude, and I don't get it because people will do it and they don't think it's a big deal because they're speaking in, for example, let's say language A, and then yet you'll have two other colleagues who again are not from America and not from country A, they're from country B, and they'll be talking, and then the people from country A are upset that people from B are talking in their language, but they don't realize that it's rude when they talk in their language. So when you're in a group setting, speak English every single time for every single issue here. It's just not nice. It's not professional. I can't emphasize that enough. If you're on your lunches, you have like meetings and stuff. So a lot of my colleagues will go to like group lunches, and there's a bunch of them from the same country. They will all be speaking in their native tongue, native language here. Completely fine, whatever, right? You go do you. But at the end of the day, when you're in professional environments and engagements, do not speak in your native language. You need to be using English if you're going to be having presentations and meetings. Okay, and the next one here is going to be for men specifically. I don't know if this applies to women, but for some reason, and it's even some Americans have been doing this, and I think it's just odd and weird. When you're a guy and you're going to go to a urinal, so you're standing to go to the bathroom real quick, and then somebody else comes in, so there's a couple things here. You need space between the urinals. If there's 3 urinals and one guy, like I'm at the first one, you should try to leave an extra one if possible. If there's already 2 people in there and you're the third one, whatever, not a big deal. Leaving space, I think, is like an American thing. I need my space around me. I prefer not to be standing right next to you, which is a whole nother topic, which I'll talk about in a second. But the other thing, too, is it's odd when you're talking to me at the urinal. I think it's weird. There are some Americans that are also doing this. This is definitely not like an international only thing. But it is odd when you're trying to go to the bathroom and somebody is literally looking you, like they turn and they're looking you eye to eye and they're trying to have a conversation with you and you're trying to go to the restroom. I don't know. It's just weird. There's a bunch of Americans that are like me, I guess. Maybe I'm the outlier. But we think it's odd, right? I'm in there to go to the bathroom. Just wait till I finish, and I'm washing my hands. If you want to like talk at the sink and whatever, it's all good. I don't know if this happens in the women's or not. Maybe you're talking stall to stall. It's just weird and awkward. And also, do not, I cannot emphasize this enough, do not take a meeting call when you're in the restroom. And yes, I have seen this, I have heard this, I've experienced this, and this is just weird and odd and disgusting in many ways. I have been on a call and someone has flushed the toilet while you're on the call. Like you're on a conference call with like 10 people, 5 people, maybe it's a smaller one, and somebody flushes the toilet. I don't know. It's just gross. It's weird. It's not socially acceptable in the US, and yet people do it. Yes, even Americans do this. I run into this constantly. I think it's odd and weird. Just avoid it if possible. And then walking so close. This is something I think that is somewhat interesting and unique. So in the United States, I don't know if it's because we have so much land and not enough people, but in the US, we like to have space between us. I remember in grad school, I was walking to class and I ran into one of my colleagues or one of my classmates, and she's like talking to me and we're walking down like a sidewalk and there's tons of space. And she's like, I don't know. She's kind of like her arms are in, they're close to her, and she has like her backpack and everything on, which is fine. And then she's like right on me. Like we're touching as we're walking, and as I scoot away from her, she's like coming with me. Right? I understand this is something different in every culture, but it's in the US, we do like to have our space. Again, as an American, try to be understanding this is something that's just culturally baked in to different cultures. But in the United States, it's just odd. It's just different. We like to have our kind of our space and our freedom. The same goes for talking. So distance between faces while you talk. Many cultures don't mind being like very, very close to you. In the United States, we like to have space, and I guess our personal bubble that we expect is quite large compared to many other cultures. But again, it can make Americans uncomfortable. If you're going to be meeting someone or chatting with someone and you're from another country, just kind of be aware that like if you're scooting close to them and you're trying to talk to them and they keep scooting back, just try to give them a little more space. It will make it more enjoyable for both sides in the conversation. The head shake is something else that is unique to a very specific culture. I've noticed it's a few different ones as well, though. It's nothing wrong with it. It's just different. So you'll be chatting, and then like when they agree with you, they do like a head shake thing. It's interesting. It takes Americans off guard. I think sometimes you're kind of confused what's going on. If you see this and you're an American, this is completely normal. They're agreeing with you. Essentially, it's like a good sign, but it's just something unique and different between cultures. And then this one is specifically for Americans on here. So many cultures have different sayings, but I've learned that Americans have apparently way too many sayings because, yes, I'll have American colleagues that use sayings that I have not heard of because I think it's regional sometimes. So if you grew up in like the Northwest or the West Coast or like Southeast or Midwest or Northeast, whatever, the sayings will be different. And because of that, sometimes there's not a translation. Like you were saying a saying and it means something. So it's like an analogy kind of, but not everyone will get it. This is extremely challenging for your international colleagues. And I have colleagues ask me all the time. And sometimes I'm like, it means this in general. I don't know where it comes from. And then we start Googling it and find crazy stories on how these sayings originated. So even as an American, I don't understand a lot of times the origination story of where a lot of these sayings come from. And sometimes I don't even know the sayings. Again, as an American, try to avoid using too many common phrases and sayings unless you want to explain them explicitly to your colleagues, because most of your international colleagues are not going to have heard all these crazy sayings that we have in the US, and there are a ton of them. I do think it's very fascinating. Some of my international colleagues will say something and they don't know how to word it, so they'll use their saying. And then they'll actually explain to me like what that means and ask if we have an American version, and typically we do. And it's kind of interesting to compare cultures and how the stories and sayings are different, but something to kind of keep in mind. Something else to keep a note here, again, this is both sides of it here, but is gender. So gender is kind of an interesting structure, so not gender itself, but gender in language. So in English, we have genders assigned, and in a lot of European languages, for example, objects have a gender, which we don't have in the US, which is one side of it. But in many Asian cultures, so for example, like in China, they don't assign a gender to the discussion. So this seems kind of odd and backwards for us in America, but this is how they work. So be wary when you're talking, both if you're international or if you're an American, right? Try to keep up to the conversation. A lot of times they'll be talking about their mom, and they'll be saying, he did this and he did that, indicating it's a boy. But that's not what they're meaning. So it's a little confusing for Westerners a lot of times. But they don't have that gender connection. So for example, they're calling their mom a he just because they don't have that in their language. So it's hard for them to remember, wait, it's a she, right? You have to say she did this or he did. Like there's different pronouns. They don't have that. So in conversations, sometimes it can be a little confusing to keep up with them. Also for them, they try really hard, at least a lot of them do, to try to get those gender pronouns and everything straightened out. I don't really worry about it too much, but again, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as something that's different between the cultures. The other thing is don't discuss race or income in the US. So I cannot emphasize this enough. I've been put in some really awkward situations because of this. So colleagues will ask something about a racial tension or just race in general. And in the US, it's a huge no-no. I don't know how to say this. Like, it's okay to talk about race, I guess, in a way, and I think it should be more open in general. I think people should have more open discussions and kind of more understanding on both sides. But a lot of people that come from other countries don't understand the racial issues and tensions in the US. And so they'll ask questions that come off as very racist. As an American, when your colleagues ask you something, try to be more understanding and open and perhaps explain the situation in America. But at the same time, for example, it makes me very uncomfortable when people ask, not because I'm uncomfortable talking about it, but because I'm more uncomfortable explaining it to you and having another American or like an HR person overhear the conversation and then jump to conclusions and be upset that you're talking about race. Income is another thing that's kind of odd. So other countries are more than happy to like share how much money they make and talk about how much their parents make or their kids make or whatever. And the US, it's not polite and it's not looked highly upon to talk about income. So it's not nice to say, oh, I'm making X amount of dollars and like sharing all this information. I know some people are going to get upset in the comments. I'm sure, they want equality and income and all that, and they want everyone to publish their stuff. I think it's nonsense and it creates a lot of tensions and divides because, again, there's a lot of miscommunication and understanding between different jobs and what are required. But in general, if you're international, don't talk about race, don't talk about income. Your conversations will be much more streamlined. Also, try not to talk about politics. So, for example, if you come from another country and you're in the US and you think like, oh, I'm super conservative or you're super liberal, it doesn't really matter. But again, try not to talk about these at work. It causes tensions and arguments and disagreements, and there's really no reason for that. Sure, if you build relationships with colleagues, you can chat more openly. A lot of my colleagues and myself are quite close, so we talk about random things that I don't think would be deemed somewhat appropriate in many settings. If you want to avoid tensions, though, just avoid politics, income, and race. So simple and easy. And then that leads me, I'm going to talk a little bit about political correctness in the US. So all three of those topics, so income, politics, and race, are essentially being politically correct. The United States is big on being politically correct. For those of you that know me, I'm not a big fan of it in general. I think people should be a little more open, a little more free to talk, as long as you are respectful and listening and trying to be understanding of other people and other cultures. It's very challenging, though, when you add in internationals because, again, a lot of the U.S. connotations on what is politically correct here are not the same as in other countries, and trying to understand that a lot of times if they say something and it comes off again as racist or insensitive or not correct, they're not trying to be most of the time. It's just that there's just different rules and cultural differences, and because of that, it makes it challenging. So again, if you're international, just try to be wary that there are weird political correctness things in the U.S. that, again, are just common everyday phrases. One of these I'll give you an example of. Don't talk about your colleague's weight. It seems really rude and negative in the US, and I know this is common in other countries and it's not that big of a deal. But in the US, it is not nice to say like, oh, you've gained a bunch of weight. Like, oh, like basically pointing it out to someone like, oh, you're getting heavier. It's somewhat of an insult in the US, so I would not say like, oh, you look like you're heavy. Yes, my friends tell me I've had one of my good friends I went to grad school with will be like, oh, it looks like you've gained weight. Like, oh, would you gain 5-10 pounds? Right? And an American, right, you're listening to this thinking, that's so rude. Like, why would you ask that? Like, it's insulting. And yet, I understand my friends that's culturally different for them. I joke with them. I just kind of laugh it off. It's not a big deal. I understand they don't understand necessarily those boundaries. But again, if you're coming from another culture, do not ask that. I also lead into that. If you think your colleague or a friend is pregnant in the U.S., you do not ask. Yes, this is something that people don't understand in other countries. So if someone's pregnant and you ask and they're not pregnant, then essentially it's insulting of me saying like you are fat and you're overweight and you're unhealthy. It's just not good to ask. Just wait until they tell you and say, hey, I'm pregnant, whatever. Then you can be like, oh, congratulations. Like, is it a boy or a girl? And you can be all excited, but just don't ask. It's just not polite in the US. And then finally, the last discussion for this entire video, and I could go on for hours pointing out all kinds of interesting differences between cultures in the US here. The last one is how kids are raised. So this comes up a lot with my colleagues, and I think it's because of the generational gap and differences that we have. So I am in my 30s, so when I was, a couple years ago, right, I'm still in my late 20s. I'd graduated grad school fairly recently. So for me, I'm connected to college, grad school. I'm more in that beginning phase. I have colleagues, though, that are actually in their 50s, and they have kids that are my age that are either just graduating college or are going to be starting college soon. Um, and how you raise kids is an interesting conversation to have because it's so different between different cultures. So in the US, not for all Americans, obviously, but there's a large portion of Americans where it's like you turn 18, you're an adult, you're on your own, you pay your own bills, you go out, you get married, have kids, live your own life. Uh, and then eventually, right, you get old and whatnot. That's kind of the cycle. Other cultures are different where essentially the parents take care of the kids past 18 and they take care of them for so much time. And then when the parents become old, it is the responsibility of the children to take care of the parents. The US, it's not as common, it's not as structured as this. So it makes it odd because some of my colleagues baby their children, they pay for all their college, they pay for all their expenses, they pay for them to go on vacations, which I think is crazy. But it's definitely a cultural difference where in America, yes, there are rich and wealthy people and their parents baby them and spoil them. But in America, it's viewed as like you're spoiling your kid rotten and like it's essentially not good parenting to do this. But it's very interesting to see how other cultures do this because it is how they're structured. So they actually pay for their kids for college and all that, and they take care of them and help take care of their grandkids, for example. And then when those parents become too old, then the kids and the grandkids will help take care of the parents. It's very interesting. It's very different. But again, having these discussions and looking at these, I think, are kind of fun and exciting topics and conversations to have. But in general, I'm just going to wrap it up with that there. Things are different, cultures are different. On both sides, US, American, and then also foreigners, so the vast majority of quantitative finance people, try to be open, try to be understanding. 99.9% of the time when something comes off as insulting or rude, it's not intended to be that way. So again, if you're international, it's even more challenging, right? Because you have your culture and your identity and you're trying to assimilate with America, but also a lot of your other colleagues are from different countries. So you can have 3 or 4 or 5 different cultures all interacting together on projects, which I think is pretty amazing and unique. But at the same time, try to be understanding. Again, you can go through the list of things I talked about here and think about, I might have done something that offended a colleague. If you do offend a colleague and you know you offended them, it is always best practice to say, I am sorry. I have said something that came off as very insensitive to one of my colleagues. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought about it. I realized later thinking about the interaction that I think they took it as an insult. And so I actually apologized to them in person and said, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean, to offend you. Guys, try to be understanding. Try to be, friends and learn to work with other people of other cultures. So anyways, thanks for listening to this podcast. And as always, until next time.